Welcome everybody to the Bi Plus History and Archives panel. We got some fantastic presenters on the docket today. And we'll be starting off with Anna-Lea Gisela Krampe, who's got 15 minutes with us. So Anna-Lea is 27 years old and is currently studying history at the Bielefeld University in Germany, where she specializes in pre-modern history with research interests in gender and sexuality history. After her studies, she's planning to do a doctorate in the same field. And today she'll be presenting part of her master's thesis, which deals with the bisexuality of women in the Middle Ages and early modern period. So everyone join me and welcome Anna-Lea Gisela. And can you share your screen? Are you able to? Yeah, okay, perfect. So go ahead and then the floor is yours. Actually, just really quickly before you start, we'll save all questions for the end of the panel just to kind of save on time because it tends to be a bit more convenient to do it in that way. So if any questions pop up as our speakers are speaking, feel free to put them in the chat or write them down and you can discuss them later once everyone's done presenting. So thank you, Anna-Lea, and you go ahead.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about the absence of female bisexuality in the medieval and early modern history, and I hope you can all hear me. The topic is part of my master thesis, which I handed in just last month, and I want to begin with the relevance. It is only when we identify, understand, and acknowledge the role of bisexuality that we can really begin to understand the beautiful complexity of human sexuality across time. With these words, the psychologist Julia Shaw points to the necessity and cognitive potential of dedicated research into bisexuality, which could lead to an understanding of its diverse manifestation in different time-bound contexts. The goal of my master thesis is the visibilization of invisible bisexual women in sodomy trials in the Holy Roman Empire. Since there are a few challenges to this, there are no publications on bisexuality in the European Middle Ages and the start of the early modern period. Because in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period, there was no term to characterize bisexuality. So Middle Ages and early modern period refers roughly to the 10th to 18th century. And the social orders in these times were characterized by monosexuality. Nevertheless, bi+ people have always existed and their existence can be proven historically. For example, in sodomy trials in the Holy Roman Empire. And in my presentation, I would therefore like to talk about the absence of bisexual women in historical research and theories. Even though this is a conference about bisexuality, I want to give you a brief definition of one I used in my master thesis, since there was no term for the Middle Ages, so there is nothing in the sources which can be directly read as bisexuality. Bisexuality is defined as the potential for romantic and/or sexual attraction to more than one gender, which can go hand in hand with a gender preference. And in my master thesis, I historicized parts of the Kinsey scale and the client sexual orientation grid and analyzed sexual behavior, marital status, and the so-called het-homo lifestyle from the client sexual orientation grid. So in this case, I looked at norm violations in relation to the heteronormative gender orders of the Middle Ages and the early modern period. And before I tell you more about my master thesis in specific, I want to talk a bit more generally about the absence of bisexuality as a concept in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, which is shown first in the legal definition of sodomy. As Domeyer and Mühling, two historians, write, sodomy can be defined as a variety of forms of sexual deviance. It referred broadly to all sexual practices that were no part of heterosexual marital reproduction. These include marital, oral and anal intercourse, onanism, masturbation, necrophilia, zoophilia, and also homosexuality, or better to say, same-sex sexual activities. Second, the absence of bisexuality is also visible in the pre-modern marriage law. And here I made 3 points. First, the definition of marriage as a relationship between two people of different sexes, which is linked to heteronormativity and monosexuality. Then the prevention of marriage annulment, which is linked to monogamy and monosexuality. And the definition of adultery, which is linked to heteronormativity again, since sexual practices between people of the same sex, even if these people were married, did not count as adultery and were just seen as sodomy. Now, coming more to the bigger part of my master thesis, the sources and the databases I could use. There are just 7 cataloged records of love and sexuality among women in the Holy Roman Empire between the 15th and 18th century. And here you can see a map of Germany today with all the 7 cases. The first and only ecclesiastical trial did happen in Constance, so really in the south of Germany in the 15th century, and the last trial with the last known execution of a lesbian all over Europe took place in Halberstadt in the beginning of the 18th century. And the types of sources are mainly court records, files, and interrogations, but there are also a few chronicle reports. But in my master thesis, I focused on the court records and files. And I've just looked closely on or focused on 2 sodomy proceedings. The first case was a secular trial of the free imperial city of Speyer, which you can see here, in spring 1477 against Katharina Hetzeldorfer, Else Mutter, Else Michels, and Schreckspön. And the 3 secondary defendants, Mutter, Michels, and Schreckspön, all had at least one sexual encounter with the main defendant, Hetzeldorfer, and Hetzeldorfer was therefore executed by drowning in the Rhine, while Mutter and Schreckspön were banished from the city of Speyer, and there was no judgment against Michels. And the second case took place 70 years later, and it was a secular proceeding of the chief magistrates of the free imperial city of Freiburg im Breisgau, so also in the south of Germany, in between winter 1547 and spring 1548 against Agatha Ditschi and Anna Reulin. They were married, and here's also a very different judgment, because Ditschi was punished severely with the neck iron and banished from the whole region around Freiburg im Breisgau, and there was no judgment against Reulin, and their marriage was annulled because it wasn't a legal marriage. And to conclude with, these are the results I found out in my master thesis. First, there's a clear differentiation between the main and secondary defendants, which also concerns their sexual behavior, so lesbian versus bisexual, or better to say, you can read their behavior, and especially their sexual behavior, as lesbian or bisexual, since it's not in the sources. Second, the lesbian main defendants were publicly executed or severely physically punished, as I've shown with the 2 cases, although all women did engage in the sexual acts and there are no hints to sexual violence. Third, the bisexual secondary defendants who were married to men or engaged in sexual or romantic relations with men at some point in their life, mainly at the same time, they also had sexual encounters with women, were not punished at all or punished much less than the main defendant, and therefore it can be concluded that there were no concepts of bisexuality in the Middle Ages and the early modern period in the Holy Roman Empire, and that the modern prejudice against bisexuality did not exist either, which is why the bisexual secondary defendants who committed sodomy and in some cases de facto adultery, as I've explained, from the perspective of the pre-modern justice, were hardly or not at all punished. And now coming to historiographical theories, these, to my mind, reinforce the invisibilization of bisexuality, as they are often based on binarity and dichotomy. And in terms of source material, the attention-grabbing fate of the main defendants is more interesting and provides more information, making it easier to analyze, although it is voluntarily, it is an voluntary invisibilization. For example, Helmut Puff, in his theory of female sodomy, reads the secondary defendants as witnesses to the trials. So there's a clear misinterpreting going on in these studies. And here you can see mainly the sources and some of the literature I used for the master thesis.
Thank you, Anna-Lea. That was fantastic. Thank you for starting us off on this panel. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions at the end of this as well. So we'll move on to our second speaker for now, Tommaso Mori, who's going to also be presenting for 15 minutes. So, hi. So, Tommaso is a bisexual and non-binary activist. Since 2020, Mori has curated BiArchivio. Am I pronouncing that right? It's Italian.
BiArchivio.
Which is an archive that is focused on bisexual, pansexual, and non-monosexual history, with a particular emphasis on Italian history. In 2019, Mori served as head of visual communications for the first Pride parade in their hometown of Modena, Italy. Mori is also an activist with Orgoglio Bisessuale, a collective that organized the first bi+ rallies in southern Italy, Emilia-Romagna, and Florence. In 2021, Mori was a spokesperson for bi+ issues during a nationwide protest, which advocated for LGBTQIA+ rights in Italy. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Tommaso, and you can go ahead and present whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, and this is such a warm welcome, and I really appreciate it. I will share the screen here with you, so I can present you a little bit of my research, and I hope that you can see it now. Let me know if you can see the first slide. And yeah, so today I will be talking about the BiArchivio. As Gabriella introduced, BiArchivio is an archive, and today I'll be talking to you, and I'm so glad to be here. And so thank again, Gabrielle, Derek, and all the people that make this day possible. And it's a wonderful opportunity. And so BiArchivio started in 2020, and I started because I needed to connect, I felt the need to connect with people in the bi+ community in Italy, because before the existence of Politica della Bisessualità by Aurelio Castro, for example, there were no unified efforts to have Italian bi+ history in Italy. What I did was connecting with people that worked in bi+ activism in Italy over the course of 30 years, from the 90s to today, and started a cycle of interviews. Right after this, I decided to start collecting materials, artifacts, and any object that could tell a story about bi+ activism, both in Italy and also abroad. Why did I do this? And I feel that the answer might be very common to a lot of people. I did this because in Italy, as we heard even earlier in the session by Aurelio Castro, that talked perfectly about like the situation of bi+ activism and the relationship with the queer community. Even in Italy, we still have a lot of biphobia and bi-negativity that leads to a lack of proper representation, even in history. And to give you an example about the bi-negative attitudes, I will give you just a couple examples that are going to be terrible, so bear with me, they're not going to be fun, but they're going to give you a clear context of what we're dealing with in Italy. This is Fuori, out in Italy. This was the most important magazine for the most radical and active homosexual liberation movement in the 70s. This specific number was published 2 years after the so-called Italian Stonewall. And they were talking about like bisexuality, and this was what they were saying. And I will translate it for you. It says that bisexuality is always heterosexuality and cooperation with the enemy. And so this was the context and the milieu that bisexuality was welcomed with in the 70s. And unfortunately, these feelings kept on going. 30 years later, we see in 2006 an article called "Does Bisexuality Exist?" published in gay.it, the largest publication for queer news in Italy. And this is what has been said. I will translate it, and again, I'm sorry for the biphobia and the foul language, but these bisexuals, this is what's said, these bisexuals in the LGBT movement where have they been ever seen? They swarm every chat, every fuckhole, every bush, and every club. But when there is time to make politics, they shine for their complete absence. Especially there's a, it goes on saying, we have a bisexual movement abroad, but there's no one in Italy. And the person saying this, it's Giovanni Dall'Orto. Giovanni Dall'Orto has been acclaimed as the most influential historian of homosexual history in Italy. So that will give you an idea of even our research, what's the effect of these regional research. And the effect is that even if people that study history and are scholars in this field talk about bisexuality in this point, it means that the effect is that like sources of bisexuality are going to be very, very few, and there's going to be a difficulty in studying a history that has not been considered worthy of recognition and preserving. So my case history will start from this. From the very fact that I will present a project that I've done here about rediscovering a community in Italy that was active before this article came out. And my search started not on Italian searches, but on foreign one, because I found out in the Bisexual Resource Guide edited by Robin Ox that in Italy, in 2001, there was indeed a community that was making bi meetings. And so I started searching people. And the first person that I met was Sandra Di Muzio. Sandra Di Muzio is a bisexual activist that was also active in the 90s in Italy. And Sandra was even writing articles. For example, this is an article that she wrote, and the title is Love Doesn't Have a Sex. And it talks about attraction independent of gender in the 90s in Italy. And it's like, whoa, when I saw this, I was like, whoa, like there's like prototypes of pansexuality in Italy. And I found it really, really interesting. And as I was interviewing Sandra and I asked her about her story, she told me that the group that she was part of was even active and in doing conferences. And there was even a recording of this group talking in lesbian spaces about bisexuality. And I was so eager to learn about this. But then she told me that, yes, she had a tape, but this tape ended in the landfill. And so it went to trash, and my heart broke because I was like, okay, this is exactly what happens in Italy if we don't preserve a bisexual history, right? And my next point was like, okay, we are losing stuff, but we can continue and we can interview the people that were part of this group. And the second person that I met was Maddalena Canale, that I see is also present here, and I'm welcoming. And Maddalena, in the late 90s, started publishing advertisements on feminist outlets like Noi Donne, a magazine. And back in the day, internet was not particularly strong in Italy. So like public advertisement in which were the way to communicate between strangers. And Maddalena started writing these advertisements in which she was asking people to create a group in Bologna, in the city of Bologna, in Italy. And people started writing her. And Maddalena shared with me so many letters from women that were writing her, trying to find a place to talk about bisexuality, saying that lesbian communities were not welcoming at the time about this topic. And some people were even like saying that, you know, it's very happy and refreshing. And from Rome, the only person that is talking about bisexuality here is the Pope, and negatively. So like there were like ways of trying to connect that led to the creation of a group. And this group eventually ended up merging with the Florence group that was talked about in the Bisexual Resource Guide. This group was founded by Alessandra Picucci, that not only founded this group, and she was the head of this since the late 90s, she founded the Orgoglio Bisessuale, but also she preserved this history, and she, in fact, was able to preserve another copy of the tape that ended in the landfill. So we were able to find it again and to listen to these women talk about their experiences, bi-plus people into queer spaces. And this group was active politically during marches and pride parades. And Alessandra, with Ireos, this Florence group, was able to start doing parts in parades to be visible and politically active. And the interesting part is that despite the fact that these experiences ended up in some books literally in the margins, or there were like one picture here and there, a lot of people ignore this experience on a historical level, and even in the BI+ community, there was no knowledge of this. And what I did was creating from these experiences and recordings and documents that were shared with me, a booklet called Bisexuali Ritrovat, which means found bisexuals, and talking about the activism in Bologna, Florence, and Milan in the late 90s. And 30 years later, after this experience, I was able to reconnect these people and have these women talk about their experiences during Italian LGBT+ History Month in Cassero at the Centro Documentazione Flavia Madaschi, one of the most prominent archives of queer history in Italy, in the city of Bologna, where this movement started. And this was a beautiful experience, but it's not the only project that I'm working on, and not the only movement that I tracked. There are many other movements, both Italian and abroad, and I will very quickly go through them just to give you some other ideas. And for example, here we have the first Bi-Visibility Day in Padova in 2017. It's been the first Bi+ March in Italy. Here we have Elena Lucetto, and in the center, Aurelio Castro, that is joining us and also talked about Bi+ politics earlier before. And there are some documents from the Anteros, the organization that created the movement. Other in BiArchivio, I'm happy to archive Bisexual in Toscana, a very important bisexual collective that was active in the past 10 years, and also the full archive of Orgoglio Bisessuale, which I'm also part of. I do not only archive Italian materials, but also very quickly, you might recognize some key points here. For example, the Magnus Hirschfeld, the first survey of sexual orientation in '94, in which we had bisexual people still being, again, one of the largest part of the queer community. And the original bi angles by Lisnania, the pins that later gave the color to the bi flag. The photographic archive of Vifer and John Gonzalez, and almost the full run of Anything That Moves, the magazine. And I would like to thank you with a picture of my cat on a bisexual flag. So thank you again, and I will leave you later for the questions. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Tommaso. That was fascinating. And as a bi historian myself, I loved seeing all those archival documents. So thank you. That was great. And I'm sure you'll have, again, lots of questions at the end. So please feel free to drop anything in the chat for Tommaso as well.
Thank you.
All right. So we're going to move on to our third presenter on the panel, Wohoshini, who is an artist and a musician based in Paris, France. Wohoshini writes the newsletter Bi, a newsletter about bisexuality plus with a feminist and interdisciplinary approach. She's also curating the online gallery Bi comme Bi für cœur to provide visibility to Bi+ artists. So let's welcome her, and feel free to take the stage whenever you're ready, Wohoshini.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I don't have slides because it's a weekend, so no slides. And today I'm going to talk to you about something I've become very interested in the past year, which was the early moments of the homosexual political movement in France when it started in the early 70s. And so in the wake of the students and the proletarian uprising of May 68 in France, the first politically active homosexual movement in itself was called the Homosexual Front for Revolutionary Action, also called the FAR, the Front Homosexuel d'Action Révolutionnaire. And it was created in 71, and it also published something called the Report Against Normality, Rapport contre la Normalité. And this report was a collection of texts providing a radical critique of the heterosexual and capitalist bourgeois system, And it was described, and there bisexuality was described as liberal, politically dubious, and looking for an escape from truly revolutionary work. And so at best, bisexuality was disregarded as a practice for some post-revolutionary utopian future. And so as I was reading the far, calling these bisexuals some super revolutionary know-it-all, and I'm quoting, I really wondered how bisexuals became such targets for this type of content, all the while remaining seemingly silent in the political discourse at the time in France. So I started conducting some historical investigation to see if I could find early political bisexual voices and explain the position of the far towards them. And so first, I wanted to understand the political context at the time and what type of discourse about bisexuality were available at the time in the years before the creation of the far in 71. And in France at that time, the main homosexual group was called Arcadia, and it was also publishing a review on a monthly basis, which contained literary reviews, essays about what was happening in France, but also in Italy, in Spain, in the United States, and as well as fiction work on homosexuality. And so I looked into the monthly reviews between 1967 and 1933. There was quite a lot of content to read through. And actually the number of articles mentioning bisexuality, either by its name explicitly or just by describing some of the practices that could be named bisexual today, is quite small. Well, no surprise, right? Daniel Guérin, who is best known for his work on anarchism, might be one of the very rare examples of an openly bisexual authors who defended bisexuality several times in the pages of Arcadie. And there was also, I found another piece that I found outstanding. It was an interview which was conducted by Françoise Daubonne, who is a French feminist and environmentalist that is known to have initiated the ecofeminism movement in the 70s. And she conducted an interview with a couple of bisexual men. And it really provides one very rare example of a very detailed testimony of the romantic and sexual life of a French bisexual male couple at the time. In 1968, the journalist Dominique Dalérac published an important book in France about homosexuality, which was called Dossier Homosexualité, something like Homosexual Files. And bisexuality was also studied here. And this book was fairly well received by the critique of Arcadie. And the way Dalérac talks about bisexuality is deeply rooted in the medical and psychoanalytic approach of the time. So to summarize quickly its views, bisexual men are meant to become exclusive homosexuals sooner or later, because the deviant part of sexuality is necessary to take dominance over time. And as for women, however, bisexuality is considered as a better option than exclusive homosexuality, since it keeps them available for maternity and for men. So we find already this idea that bisexual men are gays, after all, and that bisexual women are still subjected to patriarchy. And this is important because these are exactly the same views that are going to be defended a few years later by the homosexuals of the far themselves, without putting into question the frame and the medical and psychoanalytic frame in which this type of discourse has been produced. So when the far is created in 1971, it publishes several important pieces in a left-wing newspaper called Tout, literally everything. And this newspaper, the publication director was Jean-Paul Sartre, who was mentioned. So we can, in this newspaper, we can read here and there a few discreet, yet very direct bisexual testimonies. For example, someone wrote, "I thank the girl who taught me about boys. I thank the boy who taught me about girls. And I say fuck to bringing sexuality into line." And someone else suggested this definition for bisexuals, who like both with their own sex and the other, can never be can never be it entirely in the current society. Normal, natural, family, fuck you. However, bisexuality is mostly something that others, and by others I mean exclusive homosexuals or officially exclusive homosexuals, talk about. So there are 3 cases I'd like to review. So first, bisexuality is talked about as an omnipresent, even if actually mostly silent, political threat. So on the one hand, bisexuals allegedly don't really assume homosexuality and can't experience sexuality outside the dominant heterosexuality framework. Thus, they cannot participate in a revolutionary project to eradicate oppressive patriarchy. And on the other hand, the very existence of the bisexual category threatens exclusive homosexuality, which is considered at the time as essential to dismantle the heterosexuality, patriarchal, bourgeois family. Second, bisexuals appears as a sexual figure of the other. And it is used in the post-colonial discourse when members of the FAR talked about the sexuality of North Africans. They use the trope of saying that bisexuality is widespread in North African/Arab societies among men, provided that these men played the active role in sexual intercourse, be it with men or with women. And in this discourse, Arab men are depicted in a very sexualized way. They're depicted as being misogynistic and very manly, and they're at the same time they're being objectified for white homosexual desire. A researcher, Todd Shepard, in his works about masculinity and decolonization in France, suggests that the Arab man embodied at the time an alternative to the heterosexual and homosexual binary, even if Shepard himself never names it as bisexuality. So it is telling at the time that members of the FAR explicitly used the word bisexuality for North African men, but not for their own white comrades. Because one has to remember that historically, and that's something that Stephen Angelite and others explain in their work, bisexuality was built as an imperialist and racist category, which would refer to sexual practices in underdeveloped human beings and societies. And so in the French case, it is interesting that bisexuality is used here to refer to the sexual practices in North African societies, which are described at the same time as gender societies with high inequalities between men and women. And so let's remember, and this is important because for the FAR, patriarchy can only be overthrown through the practice of exclusive homosexuality, and hence that's why they're rejecting bisexuality. Third and last point, so members of the FAR have strong opinions against bisexuality, and among them, one of the most vocal one is a French philosopher, Guy Hockenheim, who wrote about the super revolutionary know-it-alls. However, it's very funny because the very same Hockenheim writes a year later that love, even physical love, could happen between homosexual men and women. And so he writes in one text, "We like to kiss, we find each other beautiful." And in another text, he would write, "The awful penetration act being excluded, and because we haven't found yet how to live our relationships, we came to conflate our complicity towards the same enemy and a real libidinal love. Fags, dykes, women fags, fags, dykes, the less status and roles between us, the better. Everyone get their sexes and all sexes to all, and all types of connection between them, once the phallocrats have been removed, of course." And so it is as if bisexuality was, it seems, a concrete practice, even maybe among the members of the FAR themselves, but that I didn't and couldn't say its name. So bisexuality is here, but not seen. And this for me is an example that perfectly illustrates how bisexuality has been, to quote Stephen Angelite, sexual identity's most fearful ghost. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was great. That was really, really fascinating and a great follow-up to the presentations that have already happened. So thank you very much. And we're doing great on time. We'll probably have about maybe 10 minutes left for questions at the end. But before that, we have one last presenter. We have Samuel Shriuski, who's also going to be presenting for 15 minutes. and they are a German bi+ activist, a queer performance artist, and a master's student in political theory at the University of Oxford. They have published on queer aesthetics, politics, history, and social theory, and are currently co-editing an anthology on contemporary drag in Germany. Next to having co-organized the Bi+ Pride in Hamburg, Germany last year, and the Euro Bi+ Assembly in January 2024, they're also a board member of the German Bisexual Network. So welcome, and we're excited to hear from you.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, that's great. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you so much for the matching up with the other presentations. I really enjoyed listening to the three of you. I feel that we have a lot to discuss about, so I'll try to make my presentation shorter than the 15 minutes so that we have some time to actually debate. And I would really love if you were able to turn on your cameras so that I can see your faces. I mean, it's lovely to see the three of you, but maybe there are some more who feel comfortable. I will also not share my screen so it's rather going to be a bit of an oral presentation rather than a visual one. Okay, so let me kick off immediately. My question that guided me during I wrote a chapter for the Routledge Handbook for Bisexuality, which I think is going to be published maybe next year or something, so I first went into the archives in Germany. There are some archives, some are online, some are present in Berlin, for example. There's the Schwules Museum, which translates to gay museum. It's not queer museum, it's gay museum, which already tells a lot about what's there, but it's actually quite a fascinating archive. And I was guided by the question, what temporality means, has meant to people in the past, and does mean for us nowadays as activists, as bisexual individuals. And the more I went into that archive, the more I found something that was really stunning to me. It seems quite obvious now that I say it, but it was quite stunning to me when I discovered it, which is that there is a certain tendency in theorizing, but also in activist circles, to think of bi recognition and also of biphobia or bi-erasure in very spatial terms, in very visual terms. And there is very good reasoning for that. But I believe that there is something lacking, which is the temporal notion of bisexuality. And we have some definitions, I mean, the famous definition by Robin Ochs, for example, who has this temporal notion in it. Also Fred Klein's work, The Bisexual Option, is famous precisely for the temporal elements that are worked out, that are carved out, the way that past experiences shape our current desires, shape our fantasies towards the future, how all that comes together in contingent ways, in specific moments and encounters, how it is not possible to say, well, this happened because there's this linear line of, say, progress that leads to the full bisexual subject or whatever. But it's a very contingent, to say it in Deleuzian terms, like a rhizomatic way that our bisexuality is constructed, comes into being, is a sort of becoming. And that's something that I found really fascinating the more I got into the archive, that there is, in fact, a lot of thinking, a lot of bi thought about temporality, but it's sort of domineered by the more, I think maybe nowadays, more easy to grasp spatial thinking. So one question that came up to me was, is bisexuality, is it a pre-modern, a modern, or a post-modern phenomenon, to use these temporal terms to start with? And we heard something about the pre-modern and modern era. We heard something about the 70s, about the 90s. I am particularly interested in the 90s and 80s and 90s, because in Germany, that's something that was quite clear in the archive. The bisexual movement, at least in its institutionalized, organized ways, really came up due to the AIDS pandemic. So there's a lot of UK and US theorizing about bi history, and there are some people speak about different waves of bi activism. In Germany, it's quite clear there's almost nothing happening in an institutionalized way, which doesn't mean that there aren't bi people engaged in queer activism. Obviously, there are. They were quite fundamental in many ways, but the way that institutionalized bi activism happens really is a result of the German service organization against AIDS, which would in the late 80s and the early 90s fund events because they realized that bi people didn't respond to the calls for action, for self-care, for health policies, health education. So they discovered, okay, we need better terms, we need better vocabulary to speak to those people out of health issues. So that was really the origin of bi activism in Germany. And there were some local groups who were separated all around, who weren't really connected to each other. And then this AIDS activism, HIV activism funded and organized events. There are a lot of letters where AIDS activists write to local groups and are like, yeah, would you want to come to this event? It's going to be great. And they're very suspicious, being like, yeah, we didn't have that great experiences with gay activists and stuff like that. So it's very interesting how at some point it all comes together. And then in 1992, the German Bisexual Network is finally founded as an institution, as an association. And there's a lot more to say about that, which I'm not going to tell you right now. There is my chapter upcoming, so you can read about that. I'm going to leave it as a cliffhanger here. But what I do want to answer to some degree is that question that I brought up, namely thinking about, is it a pre-modern, a modern, a postmodern phenomenon? And I think in answering that question, there's also some kind of an answer to the bi-temporality, the non-spatial thinking about bisexuality and why it is hidden. And I think in the psychoanalytic and early sexological discourses of the late 18th, the late 19th, early 20th century, there is a lot of thinking about bisexuality in temporal terms, but it's a thinking that is, and I think that was raised already in the earlier talk, that is deeply colonial and racist, both on the individual and on the level of the so-called human races. So there's this thinking about a human people culture develops, and at a certain stage it overcomes bisexuality. And it's the same in Freud's theory about the subject, the individual subject. It's something that is very much early in life, and it might be like we have a certain biological predisposition that everyone is bisexual, but that's something that surely we can overcome in a civilized, good society, whatever, right? So there are all these very, very problematic assumptions that go into this way of thinking bisexuality in temporal terms. But therein, we can see that bisexuality is thought of as a temporal phenomenon, namely something that is pre-modern or pre-civilized, pre-adult, something that was that is maybe even pre-cultural or acultural, and certainly utopian in the way that it doesn't have a place. It's utopos, right? Doesn't have a place in our culture, in our current present. So that's a problem with this thinking of bisexuality in temporal terms. And similar things can be said about bisexuality in modernity. I mean, we can think about Foucault and his conceptualization of the subject as a sexualized, as a sexual being, as a being of a sexuality. And there are some bi theorists who wonder, is that the same way with bisexuality? Why do the bisexual movements happen so much later than the other ones? Is that something about bisexuality itself, or is it about the binary that is included and all that? I think what is interesting is that, at least in Germany, and I think it's to some degree the case in at least in the United States, correct me, but I think in France and Italy as well, that given the time when bisexual activism in organized form comes up, it rather dates in the postmodern era, in the era of post-Freudian work structures, schemes of production and reproduction. And that's pretty interesting, because there is, of course, then that debate, is bisexuality then a postmodern or a postmodernist phenomenon? That's an interesting question, I think. There are some articles about that question who try to go into that direction a little bit. I really do love some articles, for example, by Joe Eady and by Meryl Storr about bisexuality and its relation to postmodernity. And there's I think something that might be missing a little bit to it is a work that I tried to bring in, which is by Hartmut Rosa, who's a German sociologist who has written a lot about the temporal structures of postmodernity, and who tries to explain, who tries to explain the changes, the transformations in society. He concentrates on Western societies, capitalist societies, and he tries to explain those changes via the temporal, and explicitly via the temporal, not via the spatial transformations. And I think there is a lot that in these sociological, empirical, like broad critical theory thinking can be used for understanding bisexuality. And I think what it shows is that bisexuality in some degrees is a postmodern phenomenon, but maybe not in the way that biphobic people want it to be a postmodern phenomenon. So what they tend to say is something like, oh yeah, it's this very flexible, fluid sexuality where you can't decide, where you're like without label, and everything is fluid and nothing has substance, and it all becomes similar to our work contracts. Everything is fluid and flexible there too, which makes us even more exploitable. And is that like on a similar way the case with bisexuality? And I would say no, that's not the case. And how am I with my time? Have I already talked too much?
No, you can go for like a couple more minutes. Yeah. Okay.
I'm trying to wrap up pretty soon so that we have actually time for debate. What I found in the archives, there's this journal which was published the first time in 1994 in Germany, which is pretty early. It's even 1 year earlier than the Bi Community News in the UK. And it's in its beginnings, it was published 4 times a year, and it had a certain academic approach even, which I think is fascinating. So they did a lot of reviews of English books, but also of German books. Of some books that they reviewed were really bad, but they still reviewed them very generously, which I appreciate. And there is a lot of thinking about, is bisexuality this very fluid, and is it just beyond binary thinking? And it was very serious thinking that said, no, there is substance to it. And it's important to think about the experiences that we had, the sexual encounters that we had in the past. They shape how we are now, but also there is some flexibility, something that might be not accessible to us, and it's not, we can't control it, but there is something sort of that is beyond our subjective will, that comes from the past, that goes towards the future, and that shapes our present, our desires, our fantasies, our narratives of our past, of our development. And I think that's very beautiful, and that's a way of thinking about bisexuality in temporal terms that is not like the racist colonial discourses that put it as a pre-modern phenomenon. It's not like those who try to put it in very stable terms of modernity, stable identities, the species of the bisexual, right, who is like next to the species of the homosexual or the lesbian or whatever. And it's not like a postmodern or modernist identity, in the sense that it's not just fluid or just flexible. I think there's much more to it. It's a little bit of all of them. And I think precisely there lies some interesting tools to dismantle some of the problems that we have with binary thinking of gender and sexuality now. And this is where I'm stopping. It's another cliffhanger to some degree, but we have a debate, and I really want to hear some of the answers and questions to the other historians too. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Looking forward to the debate.
Thank you so much, Samuel. That was a really great talk that incorporated lots of theory and history at the same time, and really great questions that I'm sure lots of people are itching to answer. And we've got 10 minutes, so that's a pretty good amount of time to discuss. I want to bring up Alice's question in the chat, since they posted it a couple minutes ago. And Alice asks, what about queer time as bi time? Did you somehow connect the temporality issue also with a psychological perception of time? So I guess that's aimed towards you, but any of our other panelists can also chime in if they have any thoughts. So feel free. And if anyone else has any questions, drop them in the chat and we'll get to them as much as we can.
Maybe some of you wanna answer first. I think I need to calm down for a second.
Yeah. Take your time to like process and collect thoughts if you want to. So in the meantime, if anyone else wants to ask a question to any of our other panelists, or if any of our other panelists want to tackle that question, feel free.
And if I can give my thoughts. Oh no, I see Peroni that has like a question. So like maybe if we want to go.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I think I might have missed that one. Is it like further up?
It's just now.
Okay, Theo. I think it's more of a comment than a question, but you could still feel free to chime in. Oh wait, no, yeah. Okay, Theo has a very general question, but maybe off topic. So since we're talking about past history, Theo was wondering if we knew in our respective fields countries if there were associations that register present history. So anyone feel free to chime in.
Personally, in Italy, with BiArchivio, I'm working on also present history, because like a lot of new materials are coming out, and also I'm keeping track of new collectives and realities about bi plus politics. And I feel the challenge on an archival level is becoming in one way even more difficult, because a lot of talking about spaces and reconnecting to Samuel, I feel that, for example, now a lot of the space and thinking about a postmodern sexuality as like bisexuality, a lot of the spaces that are available for bi plus people in at an organizational level are most of the times online spaces, and artifacts that are made and created by bi plus people most of the time right now, they often only have a digital form, and often they happen to be in social media, and the preservation of the artifacts and what are produced by this community, in one way, I feel it's even frailer, more frail than collecting magazines, because as a person that works with paper as a graphic designer, also like magazines and booklets, they can survive 100 years, like luckily. While I was searching in Italy documents about communities, like I was able to find online sites that were like preserved, for example, on archive.org, but some parts of them are forever lost unless there's somewhere a server that still has those files. So I feel that preserving BiPlus history, contemporary BiPlus history is something that, like with BiArchivio, I'm trying to do. And I feel it's something that it's very important because there's a risk of losing a lot of contemporary history in just a matter of years.
Thank you for the.
I also do have a.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Samuel.
I have like some sort of an answer and also another question to you. So concerning bi time and the psychological dimension of it. I mean, I think what I was interested in, I read a lot about like queer temporalities. I mean, there's this whole discourse coming up in the, I don't know, like I think from around 2004 or 5, around the 2000s, let's say, and then onwards. And obviously, there's again a lot of bi erasure. But there is one very fascinating discussion with some major, mostly US queer theorists in, I think, 2007. I'm going to put it in the chat, and there was one theorist who thinks about they think about queer history, but they also think about how I think they say the trans-temporal touch with former communities, with former affects, has an influence on us now and our politics for the future. I think that's just so beautiful, this image of how we can get in touch in physical, emotional, intellectual, epistemological with the fights and the struggles of those bi people who came before us. And I think for me, in the bisexual network, that's one of the main reasons why I love it, being engaged in it so much, because there are people of all different ages who have so different experiences of what it means to be bi. And I think what social media somehow destroys is these differences, because there are these bubbles of like-minded and similar aged people. And I think in real life, encountering these differences and also disagreements about what it means to be bisexual, that's really crucial. And I would be interested in how you, in your research about bisexuality, maybe I think that's mostly to you, Tommaso, and Vukushini, how did you encounter age difference and maybe even in nowadays bisexual activist groups references to the history? How important is that for bi politics in Italy and France, respectively?
So in France, we have a kind of an issue, which is there is very, very, very little historical research on bi history, like on local bi history, and we have very, very few published work or even activist work and all. So there is a whole area of work to just go through the archives and start specifically finding the archive that are related to bisexual activities, which I started like in the time period of a few years in the early 70s, but like there is the same thing to be done to in the 80s, in the 19, the 20, and so on, because right now there is like not nothing, but very few things. Yeah.
I feel that it's in Italy, there's a growing interest in studying previous BiPlus history. And I feel that I agree with Samuel in the fact that there might be bubbles that are like the same age and very similar experiences, especially online. And this aggravates the fact that like interacting with previous generation and international discourse is made more difficult because oftentimes there's a technological difficulty. You know, the access on these spaces that are on social media for previous generations sometimes are harder, and when they are not hard and people are available to be on social media, sometimes there's a language barrier and a culture barrier. And also I would want to say that a lot of times I think we all know how easy and feeble can be social media in generating internal strifes and fights. And I have to say that this has not made intergenerational discourse very easy. On a personal level, a lot of the research I've focused on getting previous generations on the microphone, because I feel that in order to construct a community, you need to know where you come from, and I feel this is an important topic that we have to address, and I feel that I feel those two fields, preserving past history and preserving contemporary developments, they are the same. They are not. You can't divide them personally.
I saw a question for me about how that I would like to quickly, because like in the written form is going to be difficult. So do I see an evolution over time in the way bisexuality was perceived among the FAR? And so the fact that the FAR only existed during 1971 to 1973, so 3 years, 4 years maybe, and it was a very particular movement because it was very changing all the time. A lot of ideas moving around. There was a lot of debates internally and so on. So the way it was saying that bisexuality was perceived a certain way, we can say that from some of the written text that was part of the Rapport contre la normalité, Report Against Normality, which was like in the very early stages of the movement. And then there was like, it's mainly the writings of Guy Hockenheim, which were talking about bisexuality, and that we can follow through the years, like 1971, 72, 73, 74, and so on. So yes, I see, and the thinking of Guy Hockenheim is really, I really like it, because like he changes, he changes his mindset and so on. So yes, especially regarding what is supposed to be a political identity as a homosexual, and he was in the end, he came to refuse like the homosexual identity as in itself, and that was also one of the things that was very present during the later years of the FAR. So yeah, it was moving towards more fluidity, which to my mind I read as something that would be more welcoming with bisexuality, which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the case. Like, yeah, but then I didn't find any more documents, any writing traces or writings to support this type of study so far, unfortunately. So yeah.
As we're a bit past 1 o'clock, I mean, would love to keep this conversation going, and myself and some of the other team members have said maybe in the very near future we'll host a BiArchives in History monthly meeting to keep this kind of conversation going, because it's been fascinating and wonderful. So I really want to thank all of our lovely panelists for contributing all of your research and for spearheading such a great discussion. All of you were very enriching and engaging and insightful. So thank you so much. We'll keep everybody updated on a possible future monthly meeting on Bi History and Archives, because now that's like has to happen based on all of this. So we're going to be on break until 1:30, and then we'll start the next round of panels. So again, thank you to all of our lovely panelists for sharing with us, and we'll see you all very, very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.